From a trading post with rocky foundations, Singapore became a legitimate possession of the East India Company by the second decade of the 1800s. Lured by the free port status, merchants and fortune seekers came, many to stay. Soon a cosmopolitan, genteel city took shape. But behind this picture-perfect front, violence was brewing. Once, this was the seat of power, the resting place of pioneers and people of faith. It's a memory landmark of our childhood years and of our lives in modern times. The Hill has seen all of the major events that shaped us into who we are today. From here, we can tell 7 centuries of our story, our history from the hills. From 1823, a section of the Hill became a Christian cemetery. It remained so for the next 40 years. The graves have since been exhumed, but remnant memorials give us a clue to those who pioneered Singapore in the early years. One of the most significant tombstones is that of George Drumgold Coleman, whose eponymous structures landmark our city to this day.
He'd grown up in Dublin and he'd studied architecture. He'd been on the Grand Tour and gone around Europe and seen all the classical buildings. Then something induced him to go and work for the East India Company in Calcutta. From there, he'd gone to Batavia and he'd heard about the new settlement of Singapore. Whilst he was here, he made a few sketches and he'd actually designed a bungalow for Raffles. And then when Raffles turned up, he said, oh, this is a jolly useful fellow. And he consulted Coleman on many issues to do with the planning of Singapore town. He became the settlement's first surveyor. He laid out many of the important roads like Northbridge Road and Southbridge Road. And he also designed many of Singapore's early buildings, including the oldest surviving one, which is the Armenian Church.
Historian, academic, and author Julian Davison has had a long-standing passion for Singapore's history and architecture. He wants to set the record straight.
The plaque in the wall is all we have to remember Coleman by today. But for a long time, he was remembered by a far more imposing edifice, a mausoleum, a Gothic mausoleum, no less. And that stood somewhere on this upper lawn. And sadly, at some time in the late 50s or 60s, it was demolished. But at least we have the photograph, and we know what it looked like.
As the first superintendent of public works, George Coleman designed and built several landmark structures. But Julian is quite sure Coleman had nothing to do with a pair of cupolas up on the hill.
Now, these rather curious structures are often attributed to Coleman. I think more likely they were built by the government engineer, Captain Faber. And there's a reason for this. A friend of mine discovered a photograph of Outram Jail, which was designed by Captain Faber. And in this photograph, you see exactly the same structure as we see here. And I think this is pretty conclusive evidence that this is the handiwork of Faber and not of Coleman.
The cupolas were at the Outram prison, which housed convicts from India. Just as English convicts were shipped to Australia, Indian convicts were shipped to our region, and by the 1840s, Singapore became a major penal colony. Many came from Madras and were sentenced from 1 to 7 years of labour. They solved our manpower problem. Coleman became a superintendent of public works and convicts. And by 1847, as many as 3% of the population were Indian convicts. The convicts arrived as early as 1825, and the convict jail was built in the area where the Singapore Management University is today. They eventually moved to the Outram prison. This book, published in 1899, provides an understanding of the lives and organization of the convicts during their time in Singapore. They had a unique system of administration where they became their own warders and were grouped according to the severity of their crimes. They earned a fine reputation for quality work, especially in brickmaking. After their sentences, many remained behind, integrating in the early Singapore society.
It seems they had a not too bad a time. I guess it was pretty hard for them to escape from Singapore Island, so they were allowed to sort of come and go pretty much as they pleased.
According to the book, many of the prisoners remained behind after their sentences and, as free men, served as bullock cart owners, milk sellers, and road contractors. Coleman too remained behind, and in his 15 years of continuous work, created a series of buildings, some of which are still standing today. His style is described as Palladian, with the emphasis on symmetry inspired by Greek and Roman temples architecture, a popular style in 19th and 20th century Europe. This design was created for impact.
The architecture is representing a certain power, a certain ideology. So that's why they use order, symmetry, for example, as rows of columns. Actually, is legacy. The colonial district of Singapore is created by him. So as a planner, I think he contributed a lot in the shaping, especially the core of the colonial Singapore.
Coleman died in Singapore at the age of 48 after a feverish attack and was buried on the hill. He left behind a young wife and child. His widow, Maria Frances, married his best friend, William Napier, in the church designed by Coleman. They were to have a child, James Brooke Napier, who died very young. His memorial is one of the largest landmarks on the hill today. Other remnant memorials tell of another group of Ang Sang pioneers who built and gave credence to the young free port of Singapore, the Armenians. One of Coleman's most beautiful structures is the Armenian church, which lies at the foot of Fort Canning Hill. Though no burials ever took place on the grounds, the church is a significant reminder of the role of pioneering merchants from Armenia. It was this church that sparked a personal inquiry which continues to this day. Nadia Wright, an historian and author with Armenian heritage, first came to Singapore in the 90s.
When I first arrived, the church was in rather a state of disrepair. The Armenian community by that stage was fairly small, and in fact there were only about 10 Armenian families in Singapore at the time.
The Armenians were one of the earliest settlers who contributed much to the growth of the early port. Yet very little is known of them today.
Now, in the late 1840s, there actually was an Armenian newspaper printed in Singapore, and it's called Usomnasar, or The Scholar. The editor was David Galliston, and the man who created the lithograph was Peter Seth. It's actually a very beautiful lithograph of old Singapore.
Today, a tombstone on the hill marks the name of these Armenian pioneers.
The first Armenians arrived in the 1820s. Two of them we know of, Aristakis Sarkis and another man called Sarkis Aratun Sarkis. They were traders and they were soon joined by the Zechariahs. And in fact, the first generation of Armenians were all traders and merchants. In fact, they are Persian Armenians. And the Armenians lived very comfortably within this Muslim country for several generations, and then things did begin to deteriorate. At that stage, Armenians decided to move out to India, And then from India, traders moved to the Philippines, to Rangoon, to Malacca, to Penang, to Java, then of course down to Singapore.
Though not much else is known of Aristarchus Sarkis, his namesake of the Sarkis brothers became famous hoteliers, especially for Raffles Hotel. They were the second-generation Persian Armenians who moved into other professions such as lawyers, photographers, and hoteliers.
One curious side effect of this was that they had anglicised their names because they were largely dealing with the British community. Furthermore, some Armenian names sounded rather Jewish. So you have Moses, Zechariah, and Abraham, while others sounded Indian: Gabriel, Paul, and Anthony. So when I decided to research this Armenian community, one of the first problems I had to face was, well, which of these people were Armenian? But a number also married into the local Eurasian community, but often the Eurasians do not realise that they do have an Armenian connection.
Armenians are Christians. Many of the early settlers were buried at Fort Canning. When the cemetery at Fort Canning closed, burials took place at the Bukit Timah Cemetery. When that was closed, some of the tombstones were moved to Armenian Church. One of the tombstones recovered was that of Agnes Joachim, a hobby horticulturalist whose orchid is named a century later as our national flower. After the war, many Armenians migrated to Australia, bringing the era of Persian Armenians in Singapore to an end.
This is a photograph of the Armenian community in Singapore in 1960 during a visit by Father Mirzayan from Sydney, and you can see some of the old members of the community. The younger generation are no longer in Singapore. They are some of the Johannes children.
But it's far from the end of the Armenian connection. A new generation of immigrants from Armenia walk the same path, attracted by the presence of St. Gregory the Illuminator. Zhervok and Ani are Armenian musicians who settled in Singapore in 2008, attracted by the opportunities here for the arts. The husband and wife team volunteer at the church, holding regular musical gatherings.
So we develop some sort of audience for the performances like that, and we try to do it regularly every 2 or 3 months. There are short performances, you know, the church is not air-conditioned, a lot of people can't stay for long. It's a little less than an hour in the evening time, usually on the weekends, so people can come and, you know, get together. And that's also an opportunity for people to know each other, for newcomers to get introduced to other people and, you know, to know each other.
Like their predecessors, the new Armenians hope to do their small part to contribute to the new home.
We like our lifestyle here, and some more we have a little daughter growing up, so she was born here, and it's her hometown. Yeah, so it's safe. This is most crucial thing what every parent thinking, right? Best for their child. Yeah. But in spite of just to be safe, we like the life here. I like hot weather. We built up so many friends. I mean, we built up life, so we are just carry on.
Another group of pioneer European merchants have also contributed to our early society. Their tombs lie on the hill, and their bloodline continue to flow to this present day.
This is my beloved wife, Li Kiao, my son, Eusebio, my son, Federico, and my youngest precious daughter, Francesca. This is my sister, my second sister, Fatima de Almeida, and her husband, Joseph. This is my youngest brother, Martin de Almeida.
José de Almeida was a Portuguese naval surgeon who settled with his family here in 1825. Sensing the opportunities, he became a businessman and a plantation owner. He left a long line of descendants.
And I am Francis de Almeida, the eldest son in the family.
Francis knew he was related to José de Almeida, but he didn't know how, until he received a letter one day.
It was a letter from Dr. George Fojas, and he asked if I was related to Dr. José de Almeida, and this started my search to tracing my family tree. I went to Goa, and I had to do all my research at Panjim. It's where the archives of the Portuguese are stored. And the interesting thing about this library is that all documents are written in Portuguese. So prior to that, I learned a bit of Portuguese words. I had an interview with the director of archives, and he got back to me later saying that I had a Portuguese background, and he made me sign some documents that I was not there to claim any property. And he gave me access to quite a lot of documents, and I managed to get out some of these documents, which are all certificates and all that, but they're all in Portuguese. And they actually prove that I come from the de Almeida family tree. And it is interesting to note that even Dr. José de Almeida had children from a Malay woman, which is not recorded in our records in Singapore. When I managed to trace down from my grandfather, and I found this, the name of this man, Ignacio de Almeida. He was the first de Almeida, and he was through a Goan woman who was there, and she was part of a performing troupe that actually performed for the Portuguese when they were in Goa, and they also in Calcutta. And she had a son, and she named him Ignacio. He's given the de Almeida surname, and I descend from this family tree. This is my family tree, from Dr. Jose, Joaquin, Ignacio, Miguel, Paulo, Eusebio, and this is me. It has been a very long journey, but a very interesting one, and I have no regrets with all the effort put in on this whole thing. And I hope that my children will pick up from there and put the pieces, complete piece together someday. And it is good to know one's history so that we can look forward and, if possible, do something better about it, make the world a better place to live in.
De Almeida was buried on the Catholic side of the Fort Canning Cemetery. Contrary to popular beliefs, this wasn't a white man's cemetery. Old records show that many Chinese Christians were buried there as well. Some of the Chinese who came to Singapore were Christians converted by the missionaries in China. Many were Teochew Catholics and worked as farmers in Pepper and Gambia. Their farms were in the northern regions, around the Kranji area. News about them reached the Singapore Catholic Mission. Following their story is heritage blogger James Tan.
So in 1846, Father Anatoly Moduit was sent to Kranji because Kranji had a bustling town, called Bokokang. Father Anatoly Moduit set up a small chapel at Bokokang, and from there he actually ministered to the initial group of about 30, 40 Catholic farmers who were there. Right? And from that time on, his community started growing and growing and growing.
This created tension with non-Christians, especially the secret society, who were extorting protection money from the farmers. Once converted, the farmers stopped paying their dues to the triads.
But you must understand, till that point, the British did not control the interior of Singapore. Why all the secret society was in the jungles? Because the British had no control. So it became their refuge, a hideout. Right? So in the middle of hideout, you got one Frenchman with a bunch of converts.
The triads started pillaging the Catholic farms. So much so that most of the farmers, actually, the Catholic farmers, had to take refuge down to the city. And while this was happening, the triads were robbing the farms. They were actually, stealing all their whatever was left, their gambia, their clothing, the money that was all left behind by the farmers. Okay, and this was such a big thing at Kranji that it came to be known as the anti-Catholic riot of 1851.
In 1854, another riot occurred, but this time between all the Hokkiens and all the Teochews in Singapore. Interestingly, the Teochews that attacked the Catholic Teochews in 51 approached the Catholic Teochews for help against the Hokkiens. So there's no permanent enemy. When you find an enemy, you become friends. You see, for that short while. That was between what the historians call two punks.
The riots were frequent and unstabilized the young economy. Politically, Singapore was under the administration of the East India Company, who was not ready to invest in the future of the country.
The English East India Company from Bengal were reluctant administrators of this little island. Increasingly, their focus and concern was on India, the government of the expanding Indian territories, and decreasingly in Singapore.
Those who had vested time and money into the new country began to lobby for a more permanent status.
It was the local merchants who kept it alive, lobbied London to transfer Singapore from out of the East India Company directly back to London. So you have in Singapore in the first 30 years the growth of what will become a very thriving community.
In 1867, the East India Company went bankrupt, and the administration of Singapore was handed finally to the Colonial Office in London. This prepared the framework for an era of growth, dramatically improved by the invention of technology. It would usher Singapore into the modern age.